It had been a long drive, the kind that leaves your muscles sore and your eyelids heavy. So when I saw that old, lonely motel on the side of the highway, I figured it'd be the perfect place to crash for a night. It wasn't like I had big plans in this quiet little town. Just one night's rest before I hit the road again. The motel looked as though it had seen better days, with peeling paint and a few flickering lights outside. Only a couple of cars were parked in the lot, which didn't surprise me. I stepped inside, and the first thing that hit me was the musty, old smell of the place. Behind the front desk sat an older man with tired eyes, his face lined with years of stories that seemed to weigh him down. He barely looked up when I walked in, just glanced at me as I asked for a room. Without saying much, he handed me the key and mentioned, room 13. Some say it's haunted. If anything strange happens, just ignore it. His words were strange, but I brushed them off as some old motel story meant to spook travelers. I mean, it's not like I was staying for long, right? A quick pit stop, and I'd be out by morning. Room 13 was at the far end of the motel, away from the other occupied rooms, tucked into the quietest corner of the building. The key clicked into the lock, and as I pushed the door open, a cold rush of air greeted me. The room was small and simple, a single bed, a table with one chair, and a small TV perched on a dresser. The wallpaper was faded, and the air was thick, stale, like the room hadn't been aired out in years. It smelled like old basements, musty and forgotten. I threw my bag on the bed, took a quick glance around, and honestly, there wasn't much to see. The room looked as though it had been frozen in time. Worn out, but nothing too unusual. The window faced the back of the motel, where tall trees stood like silent sentinels casting long shadows across the ground. The bathroom was tiny, with cracked tiles and a rusty sink. Nothing fancy, but it wasn't until I settled in that I began to feel the odd, unsettling weight of the place. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was something off. The silence was suffocating, like the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I needed noise to fill the empty space, so I turned on the TV, flipping through channels. There was nothing worth watching, but I left it on, just to break the eerie quiet that had settled over me. As the night wore on, the weight of exhaustion began to settle in. I turned off the TV and crawled into bed, the sheets rough and scratchy. The mattress groaned under me as I settled in, but even though I was tired, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stared at the ceiling, the silence pressing in on me like a heavy fog, until suddenly, I heard it. A faint knock. It was so soft, I almost convinced myself I imagined it. But no, it was real. I sat up, scanning the room, heart pounding in my chest. There was nothing there. I figured it was the pipes, or the house settling, just another old building making noise. So, I tried to relax again and let my mind drift. But then it came again, louder this time, and it was coming from the corner of the room, the small chair by the table. My heart began to race, but I told myself I was being stupid. It was nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I stared at the chair for what felt like hours, waiting for it to move. And then, suddenly it did. Just a little shift, like someone had nudged it. That was it. I jumped out of bed, my pulse pounding in my ears. I couldn't leave fast enough, but I had to check. I walked cautiously toward the chair, reaching out a hand. It was still. Nothing happened. I sighed in relief, but as I turned to head back to bed, the TV flickered on by itself. Static filled the screen, crackling loudly, filling the room with a sharp, unnerving noise. My stomach dropped. I hadn't touched the remote. My hand hadn't been anywhere near it. That was it. I grabbed my bag and bolted out of the room, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't even stop to go back to the lobby. I tossed the key onto the front desk without a word and ran to my car, not daring to look back. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something in that motel had been waiting for me. The quiet town, the worn-down building, and the strange events of the night. None of it felt like coincidence. And as I sped down that lonely highway, I couldn't help but wonder, what happens in room 13 when you don't leave? The night was always the same at the drug rehabilitation center in London. Quiet, eerie, with the occasional sounds of buses rumbling down the main road. I worked the overnight shift, keeping an eye on the clients who were supposed to be resting, making sure they stayed in their rooms, or at least stayed asleep. The job itself was mundane, routine. Every hour, I'd walk the hallways, check the rooms, and ensure everyone was where they were supposed to be. Most of the time, nothing happened. Just another uneventful night in a job that didn't demand much of me except my vigilance. But then there was room 307. When I started working, the previous night staff had warned me about that particular room. They didn't go into much detail, but they said strange things happened in there. They mentioned the usual stories: clients who saw shadows, heard voices, or felt something brush against them in the middle of the night. One guy even swore he saw an apparition, a shadowy figure standing in the corner of the room that vanished when he blinked. At first, I thought it was just stories. You know, the kind of spooky tales you tell to pass the time when you've got nothing better to do. I laughed it off, figuring it was just another old rehab center with a reputation for being creepy. Then things started to get weird. Around 3 weeks into my shift, one of the clients, John, started to complain about feeling trapped in his bed every night. He said he had sleep paralysis, but it wasn't just a normal episode. He described waking up in the middle of the night, unable to move, while something dark and heavy pressed down on his chest. He would wake up in a cold sweat, his eyes wide with terror, like he'd been fighting to breathe. The therapist chalked it up to his withdrawal symptoms messing with his mind, but I wasn't so sure. What really bothered me was the cold. Every time I stepped into room 307, it felt like the temperature dropped several degrees. Now, I'm not talking about the typical chill you'd expect from a rundown building. I mean, this room was cold. It didn't matter how high I turned up the heat or how many blankets I threw on the bed. Walking into that room felt like stepping into a freezer. And the strangest part? The windows were always sealed tight. No drafts. Nothing. One night in December, when the rest of the building was warm enough to wear just a t-shirt, room 307 was freezing. The heater was cranked up to full blast, but the cold in that room felt like it had a life of its own. I tried to shake it off, but that night, the chill was different. It stuck to my bones and didn't leave, even after I walked out of the room. But that night, at 2 a.m., things got real strange. It was the quietest part of the night. Most of the clients were asleep. The halls were still except for the hum of the heaters. I went about my usual rounds, checking each room. When I reached room 307, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. Now, that wasn't unusual. Some clients like to keep their doors cracked open, just a little, to make them feel less confined. I knocked gently before pushing the door open, but as my hand touched the doorknob, something unexpected happened. The doorknob started turning on its own. At first, I thought it was John, trying to get out in the middle of the night. Sometimes, the clients would wander out to have a smoke or talk to themselves when they couldn't sleep. So, I stepped aside, expecting John to come out. But when the door swung open, no one was there. I froze, staring into the dark room. The bed was empty. The sheets were perfectly in place, like no one had moved them. There wasn't a sound coming from inside, not a single breath. I stepped inside, the cold hitting me like a wall. It wasn't the normal chill. It was heavier, as if the air itself was pressing down on me. The silence felt too loud. I stood there for a moment, scanning the room. There were no clients hiding in the shadows. No one under the bed. The windows were still closed. The night outside was calm, the streets empty. I turned back to the bed. There was no way John could have opened the door and crawled back into bed without me seeing him. The layout of the room made it impossible to sneak past me without being noticed. I had been standing right in front of the door when it opened. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. For a few long seconds, I stood in the center of that room, just listening. My breath came out in little clouds, like I was standing outside in the cold. The heater in the hallway was still running, but in room 307, it didn't matter. The cold lingered, unnatural and unshakable. That was when I became a believer. After that night, I couldn't ignore the odd feeling that hung over room 307. It wasn't just the cold, or the strange behavior of the door. There was something in that room, a presence, an energy, something that didn't want to be disturbed. I never told the clients about what happened, but other staff members had their own stories. People said they felt watched when they were alone, heard voices when there was no one around, or saw strange figures out of the corners of their eyes. I kept working the overnight shift for months after that, but every time I had to do my rounds past room 307, I dreaded it. The room felt like a void, pulling me in with an unexplainable force. I knew that something dark and heavy lingered there, something that didn't want to let go. And now, every time I walk past that room in my mind, I can't help but wonder, what's waiting in the shadows of room 307? Is it a restless spirit, or something far worse? It was a typical Saturday night in 2018, and I was 12 years old, home alone for the first time in what felt like forever. My parents had gone out for the evening, leaving me with the whole house to myself. I wasn't exactly scared. After all, I'd been alone before, and everything always felt fine. But that night was different. The house was too quiet, unnervingly quiet. I tried to shake it off and went about my evening like usual, watching TV in the living room, snacking on chips, and scrolling through my phone, playing some games. But no matter how much I tried to distract myself, the silence around me felt like it was pressing in. Our house wasn't huge, a two-story place with a basement that we never really used. My parents kept old boxes and stuff down there, but I never spent much time in that part of the house. The basement always felt off. It was cold, dark, and musty, and every time I walked past the door, I could have sworn I heard something. It wasn't a place I liked being alone in. As the evening wore on, I noticed that the quiet seemed to grow heavier, almost like it was suffocating the house. I turned up the TV, hoping the noise would drown it out, but suddenly, the TV flickered and shut off. At first, I thought maybe the power went out, but the lights were still on. I grabbed the remote, hoping it was just a glitch, but when I tried to turn it back on, nothing happened. That's when I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible thumping sound. It was coming from downstairs. My heart rate immediately picked up. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, maybe the house settling or some noise from outside. But the thumping continued, and it seemed to be getting louder. Slowly, I stood up, my legs feeling heavier with each step. The thumping was coming from the basement. My body hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, making my way toward the basement door. It stood at the end of the hallway, dark and ominous. I stood there for a moment, shining my phone's light into the abyss of the basement, feeling an odd mix of fear and fascination. The basement light was flickering weakly, casting long shadows across the stairs. The thumping had stopped, but the unsettling feeling lingered. I could feel the cold air that seeped out from under the basement door, colder than the rest of the house. It was as if the basement itself was calling me, pulling me toward it. I swallowed my fear and opened the door. As I descended the stairs, my footsteps echoed in the stillness, each step louder than the last. The air in the basement smelled damp and musty, like old things that had been forgotten. I shone my flashlight across the room, trying to take in my surroundings. The corner of the basement where a stack of boxes stood seemed to be the source of the noise. But when I reached the bottom, something changed. I heard it again. This time, it was closer. It was like something, or someone, was right behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was nothing. Just the darkness and the cold, empty basement. My breath came out in shallow bursts, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. My mind screamed at me to run, but my feet wouldn't move. Then, I saw it. A shadow. At first, it was just a shape, standing still in the corner near the pile of boxes. It was like a figure, a man, maybe. I couldn't make out any details, but the shape was unmistakable. The longer I stared, the more the feeling of being watched crept over me. It was as if the shadow was aware of me, studying me, waiting for something. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to back away, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. The shadow didn't move, but for a brief moment, I thought I saw something, an outline of a face, pale and ghostly, staring at me from the darkness. I tried to run, but my body refused to obey. I stumbled backward, falling against the stairs, my phone slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. Panic set in. I had to get out of there. With my heart pounding in my chest, I scrambled to my feet, grabbing my phone and running up the stairs. I slammed the basement door shut behind me, locking it as fast as I could. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. The house was silent again, but I could feel something lingering in the air, something wrong. The basement felt alive, as if something down there was waiting. I didn't dare go back down there. Not now. Not ever. I stayed in the living room with all the lights on, my phone gripped tightly in my hands. I didn't move from the couch, not even to check the time. I waited, feeling the hours drag on, until my parents finally came home. When they did, I didn't say anything about what happened. I wasn't sure if they believed me. I wasn't even sure if I believed it myself. But every time I passed that basement door, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still down there, watching, waiting. And that's the thing. I never told anyone what happened that night, but after all these years, I still can't explain it. I never went back down to that basement, and I never planned to. But what if the shadow in the basement wasn't a ghost? What if it was something else? Something far worse? What would you have done if you were in my place? Would you have gone back down? When I stepped off the plane in New York City in 1968, I carried with me a sense of hope, a family full of dreams, and the determination to create a better life. I had left everything behind in Bangladesh, friends, extended family, and the comfort of familiarity, but my wife, our 2 sons, and several relatives were at my side. Together, we arrived in a city that promised opportunity but demanded resilience. Our first home was in the Bronx, in a part of the city that most people avoided if they could help it. The streets were grimy, rats scurried between piles of trash, and gang violence loomed in every shadow. We endured xenophobic slurs almost daily, but those words bounced off us like water off stone. We didn't come to New York to be defeated by hatred or hardship. We came to survive, to succeed, and to build a future. Survival wasn't easy. My wife and I both worked tirelessly to keep the family afloat. By day, she sewed clothes in a dimly lit factory, and by night, I worked as a cashier at a candy shop. In between, I drove a taxi, navigating the chaos of Manhattan traffic while dreaming of a quieter life. Our boys attended school, and I saw in their eyes the same fire that had driven us to uproot our lives. They studied hard, even as we scraped together every penny to cover tuition, groceries, and bills. Eventually, our sacrifices paid off. By the mid-1970s, we had saved enough to move to Queens, where life felt more stable. The neighborhood was quieter, and our new home was a sanctuary. We still lived modestly, but we were grateful for the peace it brought. Our sons excelled in school, and every time they brought home a report card, I felt a sense of pride that made all the struggles worth it. But one day in 1980 shattered the rhythm of our hard-won peace. It was a sunny afternoon, and I was working my usual shift at the candy shop. The day had been uneventful, with customers stopping in to buy sweets and leaving with smiles. Around 2:30 p.m., the bell over the door jingled, signaling a new arrival. But the man who stepped in wasn't here for candy. He wore all black, a beanie, sunglasses, a face mask, and he moved with an unsettling calm. As soon as I saw him, my heart dropped. I knew what was coming before he even reached for the gun. He pointed it directly at me, his voice sharp and demanding. "Open the till. Now." My hands shot up instinctively, trembling as I fumbled with the register. For some reason, the drawer jammed, and my panic grew. The man's voice cut through the air again, filled with anger and venom. He shouted something I will never forget, laced with racial slurs that made my stomach churn. "Move faster, you packy." Then he pulled the trigger. I felt the impact before I heard the shot. A sharp, burning pain radiated through my cheek as I crumpled to the floor. In those moments, time seemed to slow. The bullet had grazed my face, narrowly missing my brain. I realized how close I'd come to dying. As I lay on the ground, bleeding and dazed, the man yanked the till from the counter and smashed it open. Cash spilled everywhere, and he stuffed it into a black bag before bolting out the door. The sound of his car screeching away echoed in my ears as I struggled to focus. The commotion had drawn a crowd. A handful of people rushed into the shop, their faces a blur as they surrounded me. One woman knelt beside me, pressing a cloth to my wound and assuring me that help was on the way. I tried to speak, but couldn't form words. The pain was overwhelming, but the realization that I had survived kept me from slipping into despair. Minutes later, the ambulance arrived. Paramedics lifted me onto a stretcher, their voices calm but urgent as they worked to stabilize me. My family was called, and by the time I reached the hospital, they were already there. My wife and sons were crying, their faces etched with relief and fear. "Thank God you're alive," my wife whispered, clutching my hand. The bullet was removed, and I stayed in the hospital for 2 days. The police came to take my statement, but I had little to offer. The robber's face had been hidden, and there were no cameras in the shop to capture what had happened. They assured me they'd do their best to find him, but deep down, I knew the odds were slim. The owner of the candy shop and my co-workers generously pooled their money to cover my medical bills. Their kindness was a balm for the emotional scars left by that day. But the incident shook me to my core. I returned to work, but I was never the same. Every time a customer walked in, my heart skipped a beat, and I found myself scanning their hands, their movements, their intent. Life moved on, as it always does. My family and I eventually left behind the struggles of those early years. We built a life we could be proud of, one filled with love, success, and gratitude. My oldest son became a doctor, my younger son a lawyer, and my daughter, a child born in America, became a writer, chronicling stories like mine for the world to read. Even in retirement, I think about that day in 1980. It's a memory I carry with me, a reminder of life's fragility and the importance of resilience. If there's one lesson I can share with those who work in customer service or any job where you interact with the public, it's this: always be aware of your surroundings. If you ever find yourself in a dangerous situation, don't hesitate. Do whatever it takes to stay alive. I often wonder about that man, the one who changed my life in an instant. Who was he? What drove him to such desperation? And, most importantly, what would have happened if I hadn't moved just slightly to the side when he pulled that trigger? Some questions will never have answers, but they linger, shaping the way we see the world. What do you think? Would you have handled it differently? It was one of those nights when the world felt impossibly quiet, and the road stretched endlessly ahead like a black ribbon disappearing into the horizon. I had been driving for hours on a lonely country road, the kind where the only light comes from your headlights and the occasional glint of moonlight off rusted road signs. The fuel gauge in my car was hovering dangerously close to empty, the needle dipping just below the red mark with every passing mile. I cursed myself for not stopping earlier. My phone had no signal, and the thought of being stranded in the middle of nowhere made my chest tighten. Then, like a small beacon of hope, I spotted a faint light in the distance. As I got closer, the shape of an old gas station emerged from the darkness. It looked like it had been plucked from another era, with its single pump and a flickering neon sign that buzzed faintly in the still night air. The word gas was barely legible, the paint faded and peeling. The windows of the small building behind the pump were dark, and the entire place seemed frozen in time. I didn't care about its condition. I just needed fuel. I pulled up next to the pump and turned off the engine. The air outside was unnervingly still. There were no chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, just silence so profound it felt unnatural. I stepped out of the car and walked to the pump. It was an old model, the kind with a rusty metal lever and mechanical numbers that clicked when turned. I lifted the lever and waited for the gas to flow, but nothing happened. I tapped the pump a few times, muttering under my breath, but it refused to work. Frustrated, I looked around for help. The station looked abandoned, but surely someone had to be there if the lights were on. I approached the small building, its wooden door creaking as I pushed it open. The interior was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. Dust coated everything. The shelves, the counter, even the air felt thick with it. Most of the shelves were bare, save for a few ancient candy bars and cans of soda that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. Behind the counter sat an old man. His head drooped slightly as though he were asleep, but his eyes flicked open when I stepped inside. His skin was pallid, almost gray, and his clothes hung loosely on his frail frame, worn and faded like the rest of the place. For a moment, he just stared at me, his eyes dull and unblinking. "Excuse me," I said, trying to sound polite despite the unease creeping up my spine. The pump isn't working. I need gas. He blinked slowly, as though processing my words, then reached under the counter without a word and produced a small metal key. He slid it across the counter to me, the faint clink of metal on wood echoing unnaturally in the quiet space. "Try again," he muttered, his voice rough and raspy, as though he hadn't used it in years. I grabbed the key, muttered a quick thank you, and hurried back outside. The night air felt heavier, almost oppressive. I inserted the key into the slot on the side of the pump and turned it. The machine groaned to life, and I exhaled in relief as gas began to flow. I filled my tank as quickly as I could, watching the numbers on the pump tick upward. When I was done, I returned the nozzle to its holder and glanced back at the building. The light inside had gone out. The windows were dark, and I couldn't see the old man anymore. Confused, I hesitated, wondering if I should go back inside, but something told me to leave. I climbed into my car, started the engine, and drove away, the gas station quickly disappearing in my rearview mirror. As I drove, the unease didn't leave me. The road felt darker, the trees taller, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. I shook my head, chalking it up to exhaustion. The next day, I couldn't shake the memory of the gas station. It had felt so out of place, too old and weathered to still be operational. The old man's lifeless demeanor and the silence that surrounded the station gnawed at me. My curiosity got the better of me, so I decided to ask around. I stopped at a small diner in a nearby town and struck up a conversation with an older man sitting at the counter. I told him about the gas station, expecting him to nod and share a story about its history. Instead, his expression turned grave. "There's no gas station on that road," he said, his voice steady but filled with certainty. "It burned down over 30 years ago. Some electrical fire," they said, "killed the old man who ran it." My stomach dropped. "No, I was just there last night," I insisted. I filled up my tank. I spoke to the guy working there. The man shook his head, his face pale. "Son, I don't know what you saw, but there hasn't been a gas station there in decades. That road's been deserted for years." I didn't know what to say. The memory of the station was so vivid. The flickering neon light, the old pump, the man behind the counter. But if what he said was true, then what had I seen? Who had I spoken to? To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. I've never driven down that road again, and I avoid thinking about it too much. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone in my car, I find myself glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the faint glow of that neon sign and the shadowy figure of the old man staring back at me. What do you think I encountered that night? Was it a ghost, a memory trapped in time, or something else entirely? I used to work as an advertising executive in Baltimore during the 1990s while living in New York City. The daily commute was exhausting, but I enjoyed my job enough to make it worthwhile. My routine was almost clockwork. I'd wake up at 6 a.m., hop on the 3 train to Penn Station, and catch the 7:15 Amtrak. The train ride would last around 2 hours and 15 minutes, giving me time to relax or prep for the workday ahead. For years, this routine went smoothly, until one Friday morning, everything changed. That day put an unsettling end to my streak of uneventful commutes. It started like any other morning. I boarded the 6:15 train and settled into my usual spot. Everything seemed normal as we departed, making our way through the quiet early hours. Around 6:23 a.m., we stopped at one of the final stations before heading into Manhattan. After a brief halt, the train took off again. But barely 3 minutes later, it came to an abrupt stop. At first, I thought it was a minor delay. It wasn't unusual for trains to pause briefly, though it was rare this early in the morning with so few passengers. 5 minutes passed before the conductor's voice crackled over the intercom. "We're extremely sorry for the delay. There is an issue we're working to resolve as quickly as possible. Thank you for your patience." I sighed in frustration. Delays were always irritating, but this one felt off. Another 20 minutes went by, and I started to grow concerned. The conductor returned with another announcement. "We're sorry for the extended delay. It looks like we'll be here for a while. We appreciate your understanding." An hour had passed, and the passengers in my car were becoming visibly restless. People fidgeted in their seats, muttering complaints. Then, at around 7:40, my morning took a horrifying turn. Gunshots. The sharp, unmistakable sound of gunfire echoed just outside the subway car, followed by distant yelling. My blood ran cold. A wave of panic swept through the car as everyone fell silent, wide-eyed and motionless. My heart pounded in my chest as I gripped the edge of my seat. What was happening? Was someone trying to kill people? For the next 35 minutes, the tension in the car was suffocating. Sirens blared above us, their wails growing louder and then fading as more emergency vehicles arrived. I could hear frantic voices outside the train and the clatter of heavy boots on the pavement above. It was clear that a massive police operation was unfolding right outside. I felt trapped, helpless to do anything but wait. Finally, at around 8:30 a.m., the train lurched forward. The collective sigh of relief from my fellow passengers was almost deafening, followed by a burst of cheers and applause. But relief was fleeting. We still didn't know what had happened. When we pulled into the next station, the conductor announced that the entire line was shutting down for the day and all passengers had to disembark. I stepped off the train, my legs shaky, and called my boss to explain the situation. He was understanding, telling me to stay safe and take the day off. I hung up and approached a police officer nearby, hoping to get some answers. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The officer gave me a tight-lipped response. "We can't share any details right now. You'll have to wait for the news." Disheartened, I hailed a cab and went home, the events of the morning replaying in my head. The next day, I picked up the newspaper from my front stoop, my stomach twisting in anticipation. The front page headline confirmed my worst fears. On Thursday night, a homeless man had stolen a gun from a nearby gun shop and evaded capture by fleeing into the subway tunnels. He spent the entire night hiding between stops, eluding police as they searched for him. Early Friday morning, a security guard monitoring the surveillance cameras spotted the man lurking on the tracks near my train. The conductor was immediately alerted, and the train was halted to avoid hitting him. As police officers converged on the area, they discovered the man had armed himself. What followed was a tense standoff. The report said that officers heard gunfire from beneath the stop train and returned fire, killing the man. His body was eventually retrieved, and the scene cleared after hours of chaos. I sat on my couch, staring at the paper. My mind kept replaying the sounds of gunshots, the shouting, and the oppressive silence that followed. The thought of how close I had been to such a dangerous situation left me shaken. 5 years later, I quit that job when I received a better-paying offer closer to home. I haven't taken a train to Baltimore since, and to this day, the memory of that morning haunts me. I can't see a gun on TV or in a store without feeling my chest tighten, the sound of those shots echoing in my ears. That day taught me how fragile a sense of safety can be. For anyone reading this, I hope you never have to experience anything like it. If you work or commute in an environment that could turn dangerous, always stay aware of your surroundings. And if you ever face a threat like that, remember, your life is more valuable than anything else.